Hello and welcome back. My guest today is Sanjay Anandram. Sanjay has over 30 years of experience as a corporate executive, entrepreneur, investor, mentor, author, and board member, and many other things. Welcome, Sanjay. It's a pleasure to have you over here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get started. I want to specifically start by focusing on the initial days when you started your career and very quickly moved on to being an entrepreneur. And I remember it was the turn of the century when you were here and you had launched perhaps one of the earliest funds in Bangalore,
in
Jump
India,
Startup
actually.
in
Yes.
India.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about that journey.
Right. You know, it's a fascinating look at how the entire ecosystem has evolved. Back in the day when entrepreneurship meant that you either came from a big business family or you really had no choice. Entrepreneurship was not really a line of activity intended for the educated middle class. That started changing with the advent of the internet. While there were a few sporadic examples prior to that, so from around 99-2000 is when I think the first phase of what you could call modern entrepreneurship in India really began. And that, of course, was enabled by the internet. And that is when, I and two other co-founders, we started one of India's first venture funds called Jump Startup, wanting to provide support to entrepreneurs wanting to build businesses out of India for the world as well as for India. So going back to your question about how this has evolved, when I got back from the US in 99, I started a magazine. And the magazine was aimed at driving entrepreneurship in India, saying that if there were so many entrepreneurs in the valley, why don't we have enough entrepreneurs here? And the magazine intended to sort of train, nurture, grow entrepreneurship by educating them on what needs to be done, what is entrepreneurship, what is venture capital. All of these were strange terms at that point in time. So when we raised the fund, which is a $45 million fund raised in 2000, investing in India, seeking out technology and technology-enabled businesses. If you looked at the ecosystem, what is a very sort of commonly used term now, was just about beginning to get formed. And the ecosystem has multiple players, obviously, with the entrepreneur being the arrowhead. So you had the entrepreneurs, there were hardly any funders, there were hardly any entrepreneurs. Then you had regulators, and then you had this whole class of service providers. You needed to have lawyers, tax people, marketing folks, et cetera, who would all help build the entrepreneur's business, right? All of that was just forming. And then you had entrepreneur-focused organizations, let's say like TIE, for example, which was what the leading light then, which was helping to train people and make them aware of what entrepreneurship was all about. There was no media coverage. So, nobody really understood.
From there to today, when you have 4 pages in our pink papers.
Precisely, right? So it's become very cool now.
Yeah.
It's become almost glamorous. It's almost become sexy to say you're an entrepreneur. So that journey has been quite a phenomenal journey. And, if you think about it, the word startup entered the government of India's lexicon only in January 2016. Till that point of time, the word startup was not there in any government vocabulary, which meant that funding, which meant that government schemes, which meant like things like taxation, which meant like setting up of funds and the treatment of them under SEBI, all of those did not exist in the manner that they ought to exist.
You are a global ambassador for iSPIRT, which is a think tank working and helping create digital platforms. You're also part of an advisory board over there, and you're also involved with the Data Governance Network. All of these looking into the role of these digital platforms for larger social good. For the sake of our viewers, just give us an overview of digital public goods, as you have so written about also so many times.
Right. Thanks for that question, because it's a phrase that has suddenly cottoned on in the media and everywhere else, right? And everyone's talking about digital public goods, DPGs, and so on. It is essentially, public goods in economics need to meet 2 important criteria. It's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Non-excludable means that everybody has a chance, not a chance, everybody gets to use it if they so wish.
Has access to it.
Has access to it. And non-rivalrous, meaning by using it, I'm not depriving or reducing the quantity for anybody else. Now the same ideas is now brought into the realm of the digital with an additional
So give us an
element.
example. What's a non-digital public good?
Yeah, a non-digital public good could be a public highway where anyone, any individual, any vehicle could walk on it, right? Now the moment I bring in entities to control it, manage it, price it, etc., the public good part of it starts getting constrained, right? Now if you look at the digital part of it, the digital part has another very important characteristic. It is non-depletable, meaning it's infinite, and therefore it acquires unique characteristics. Because it's non-depletable, non-excludable and non-rivalrous, and therefore, and once you have built it, the marginal cost tends to zero. And that becomes a very powerful way of thinking about providing digital infrastructure to people. Because if you look around the world today, there are 3 or 4 competing models. And this is a very unique problem that has arisen because of the rise of digital technologies.
I love the point which you made about the fact that these are what we in the world of technology call as zero unit costs.
Yeah.
In the sense that once you have built it, it's at best the cost of servicing it. So in this context, we in India have been amazingly successful with Aadhaar, with UPI and many others.
Yes.
And there seems to be a long pipeline of a few other platforms
Yes.
which are required.
Yes.
I want your views on 2 specific areas.
Yeah.
First of all, let's start maybe the other way around, looking at how India has looked at these digital goods. You
Right.
know, unlike the American model where you had enterprise creating digital infrastructure and basically making money out of it. And then you have the Chinese way where you firewalled it, you created, you waited for the right infrastructure, you copied it, and you created your own infrastructure as a consequence.
Right.
And then there seems to be the European way, where if nothing else works, you basically have
You regulate it.
regulatory oversight.
That's right.
We seem to be doing it
Yeah.
quite differently, and it seems to be, particularly the way I look at it, it could perhaps be India's defining moment in the decade to come.
Indeed. And and it's very fascinating to see how all of this has come about. And clearly, one must also confess that in the early days of its conception, the idea of DPGs itself was not in anyone's consciousness.
Yeah, this is
because
knowledge by hindsight. to
knowledge by
significant-
hindsight,
absolutely.
right? So the idea that you needed to have a digital identity for somebody was a foundational idea. And that led to the multitude of what we now call as different DPGs, DPIs, it depends on what phrase you use. But that was the start point of all this, and you referred to Aadhaar. Aadhaar started in 2009. It is also a UN SDG today. 16.9 UN SDG talks about a legal identity being necessary to help achieve the SDG goals.
When did this come about?
This happened, I think, around 2010-11 thereabouts,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So the digital ID bit of India, which is very well known around the world as Aadhaar, was really the one that changed all of this. And that project went through all kinds of
Absolutely.
trouble, all kinds of doubts, uncertainty, fear, everything, right? Because it's very natural that once you have something that is so foundationally different, there will be concerns around the table, and there were concerns. It went up to the Supreme Court. Finally, the court ruled on it, saying that while privacy is a fundamental right, the state also has the right to deliver a set of services, and that does not violate the principle of the fundamental right of privacy. right? Because if I'm supposed to give you benefits, I need to know who you are.
And this is the most efficient way, as it's been
Precisely,
proven.
and I need to know who you are, right? So there were concerns of privacy, so the Supreme Court ruling was very clear about how and when it can be used. So that put a lot of the uncertainty and fear to rest. Thereafter, once you had this, then the question is, okay, now I have a ID, what do I do with it? And then came the whole business about bank accounts. We didn't have bank accounts in India, meaning the people who needed to have bank accounts to avail of government services didn't really have bank accounts. And we are all familiar with Rajiv Gandhi's famous comment that for every rupee that the government spends, at best 15 paisa reaches the intended beneficiary. So which means
I thought 90 paisa gets lost.
So 85 to 90% just goes away. No one knows where. And that was a huge amount of money being lost every year. And that needed to be sorted out by some means. And it so happened that now I know who this individual is thanks to the digital ID. The bank account is now available. The bank account is now connected to this Aadhaar. So now there is a very clear, immutable way of being able to do the transfer. And that led to another huge surge, right, of bank accounts. Once you have a bank account,
part of it,
that's right. Now you can go ahead and start doing the payments. Now the question is, what was a big challenge in payments, right? Challenge in payments was it was expensive. Challenge in payments is handling of cash is
the transaction costs.
Transaction cost at the banks, the seigniorage cost of the RBI in actually cash management, printing the notes, taking care of the soiled notes and all of that is a big cost. So how do I deal with it? Particularly in areas where it is very hard for, let's say, the cash to actually reach. And how do I make it simple, ready at a low cost? And using a device that everybody had. So in parallel, you had this massive trend of the mobile phones becoming almost ubiquitous. So the mobile phones were ubiquitous, Aadhaar was there across the country, bank accounts were happening, right? The Jan Dhan part and what you refer to as the JAM. So this became the bedrock that enabled a lot of other things to take place.
I often tell people that we seem to be at times constrained by our past and believe that we are a technologically developing nation. But when you look at today's technology, which is mobile led, what you just described is perhaps as cutting edge as it can get anywhere in the world.
Absolutely.
And so aren't we therefore at the forefront of this?
Yeah.
And what are the implications?
Right. So I think one big takeaway from this, and it's a very important takeaway in my view, is that India didn't invent any technology. What was revolutionary was the system design.
Yep.
Putting it all together in a manner that met the objectives of a developing country like India. That, I think, was the genius of it.
Absolutely.
Therefore, when I say put a system design, what does it mean? How is Aadhaar itself built for 1.3, 1.4 billion people? How expensive is it? To give you an example, the UK had a project called Verify back in the 1990s. They scrapped it because it was unusable. And and the funny thing was they were spending about 60 pounds per ID. And then in 2006 it was scrapped. So they do not have that system anymore, but 60 pounds. In India, Aadhaar was done at under $1 per ID. That's the difference. Almost a 60x differential.
Yeah.
Now for a poor country, how do you do it? And that's what I mean by system design. One is the software. Number two is the business model of getting enrollments and registrations and authentications done. Where the private sector was involved, they had to be verified. I had to use ABIS devices and make sure that the access schemes, etc., were all authenticated, were all verified, all validated. That had to happen, and ensure that they got paid only on the basis of every authenticated ID that got put into the system. Third, among all of this was I needed to have a organization that would manage all of this and the governance of that organization. Fourth was to have a legal framework within which this would operate. If you remember when Aadhaar started, there was no law that supported the creation of Aadhaar. So when information was being sought, there were all kinds of valid fears. Thereafter, it got sorted out. So you had the law and policy, you had an organizational structure and governance, then you had a business model that enabled it to be deployed at scale at a super low cost, and then you had the piece of software, right? That is the system. Now, how it will work, how it will operate with other players, right? All of that is part of the conceptualization of what this whole Aadhaar UID is all about.
So you laid out 4 building blocks of a system. Now I could replicate this and create another system.
Yeah.
And to kind of take your analogy of UK's Verify,
Yeah.
I'm sure they also had these 4 building
They
blocks.
actually,
around.
yeah.
They had it, right? So therefore, what is it that made Aadhaar such a success?
Yeah.
And if we were to say that could perhaps be, elicited as the essential drivers
Yeah.
of success when you want to do anything at this scale.
Yeah.
1.5 billion people is huge scale.
Yeah. It's unimaginable. I don't think anybody really has a conception of what that number means.
Anyone in the Western world cannot even
Cannot
imagine what it means.
that size is,
Absolutely.
right? Coming to this point about system design and all of that, see, the UK system was designed for government by government. It did not have the citizen benefit as the goal, the fundamental issue.
So it was like a government developing a tool to
For-
make its life easier.
Precisely.
Okay. Whereas, so you're saying the objective over here, or the goal or the vision which we set for Aadhaar was quite different, and that enabled it to move the way
That's
it is.
right.
Okay.
And therefore, and that thinking, see, why is that thinking important? Because the thinking led to the creation of an identity system that is foundational. What does that mean? It means it is not linked to any function of the government or civil society. In other words, just by having an Aadhaar ID doesn't mean make it equivalent to a driving license. A driving license is a functional ID.
Offshoot of that.
Is a functional ID, meaning it is used only for driving. Health is only for health, right? Benefits is only for benefits. Pension is only for pension, right? Those are all functional IDs. Aadhaar is a foundational ID. And foundational ID essentially says that you, Prakash Bagri, by putting your biometric, it will authenticate you as being Prakash Bagri and Sanjay Anandram as being Sanjay Anandram. That is all that the function is. It does not do anything beyond that. You can use this now thereafter and have derivative schemes which are functional in nature.
So does it imply that we are in for a few decades of churn? Aadhaar, it took us more than 15 years. UPI also is what, 7 years
seven
now?
years, yeah.
So if each of these take their own decade plus,
Yeah.
are we looking at 4-5 decades, 40-50 years before we have a comprehensive array of digital platforms
Yeah.
which is leading to governance?
Yeah, these are all happening in parallel. So it's not sort of sequenced out,
Okay.
number one. Number two, because of the learnings and the experience curves that we have gone through, the half-lives are dropping dramatically. You take Aadhaar is, like you said, 14, 15 years old. You look at UPI is 7 years old. Now, already, for example, if you look at the health digital mission, what is it called, ADBM, right? So that by itself is growing very, very rapidly. There are, I think, something like 27 crore individuals registered with Aadhaar numbers, more than 100,000 doctors, etc., etc. So the numbers are growing very, very rapidly. Then ONDC trials are starting,
Yeah.
well underway, and so on. So the RBI has already issued licenses for account aggregators that are part of the OCEN network, and so on. So we are seeing a lot of these activity take place. There was a digital sky mission for drones, which also follows the same principle. There's e-Sanjeevani, etc., etc. But all of these are happening in parallel because now the way of conceptualizing, designing is generally understood. Now I just need to deploy it, design and deploy it for the particular use case of that particular vertical.
So now tell us, how do you see and this jugalbandi happening in two important spaces, and let's talk about each one by one. First is health, and then we'll hopefully get some time to talk about education.
Sure. So in health, for example, there is this Ayushman Bharat digital mission, which is operating on the same principles as, think about it as a Aadhaar plus UPI plus kind of mental model. Okay, effectively you get a ABHA, which is a Ayushman Bharat health account. There is the digital mission part of it. What is the prerequisite here? We need to have a registry of all doctors, of all clinics, of all hospitals, of all labs. We did not have a registry. In other words, we don't know how many of these exist in the country, what their credentials are, what their capabilities are, etc., etc. So that's the job number one, to first build the registries of all of this.
And you can map the professionals to each of these.
That's right. So you got that. Second, you take the insurance, the payers. So there's a patient, there's a provider, and there's a payer, right? There are three parts of any healthcare system. If you look at the payer community, payers are the insurance folks. Look, in India, there's unbelievably complicated. For example, there is the central government schemes for insurance, right? So there are any number of central government schemes that provide health insurance to its employees and former employees. Then there are many state government schemes that provide insurance for state government. Then you have schemes that are retail, where you or I as an individual can go and buy a medical insurance scheme. Then there are employers who provide insurance. So four broad categories of insurance. Right now, a vast percentage of India does not have insurance for historical reasons.
Yeah.
So now, 2 years back, there was a scheme that was launched, which was part of the Ayushman Bharat thing, where up to 5 lakhs a family would be covered for any medical mishap or emergency conditions, and there was a scheme design. Now, rolling that out, making sure it works, is a phenomenally complex problem because of the nature of the healthcare business. So there are private sector players, there are government, there are clinics, there is secondary care, there is tertiary care, there are the entire myriad of insurance schemes and all of that. Then comes the issue about fraud. Healthcare insurance fraud is a very major problem. How do I ensure that a person is being paid, compensated for the right kinds of treatment for which they have paid or underwritten that, right? So that is another big thing. So putting the system together that validates you, almost like an Aadhaar based authentication, that you are indeed the patient. Then I have to maintain your privacy because you've got your health records. How do I ensure that the health records are available only to you, that you have the ability to give consent and for it to be shared, that there is no central database that can be hacked into to get access to health records, because there's a lot of important and, let's say, confidential information, etc. Right? So that is how the system is architected.
And if I were to take your statement about half-life, by when do you think this system will be comprehensively covering every Indian?
The system will not be comprehensive. Is I think a too big a word to use. It's always a work in progress, because it's an unbelievably complex
that's
effort.
why I'm asking.
And because
when will it become mainstream?
Yeah,
it is not mainstream today.
It is not. It is, well, like I said, already about 27 crore people have got an ABHA account out of, India's 140 crores or whatever, right? So, which is not an insignificant number. Then, so my belief is that in the next 5 to 7 years, you will have a phenomenally different healthcare system. Just to give a simple example, if you go to any clinic today or a OPD of any hospital, there's a massive line just to register. Today, once this scheme is in place, and already there are several clinics and hospitals that are part of this network, where you scan the QR code, you're instantly registered, you get your SMS and you do a 2-factor authentication, and you get your appointment fixed right there, and you can go and get your treatment or image taken or whatever the case may be. then all the records that exist, already in digital form today, right?
They're not interoperable across different
That's right.
entities.
So all of that is getting done, put into what a health information exchange, okay, with consent and all of it. And again, like in the case of the Aadhaar, the benefits are not something that you or I can really experience. It is for the person who has not had any benefit at all by virtue of being sort of unrecognized by the system. Those are the people who will get the benefit the most. So if whether I get my rations thanks to DBT and bank account and Aadhaar is not that material to me as it is for somebody else, right? So the focus, like I said, in India is to get the disadvantaged into the system so that they now use their mobile phones, and thankfully everybody seems to have one, to start interacting. Then they can make payments using UPI. So each of this therefore is a block that is a necessary step for you to get to the next. You cannot leapfrog. If you didn't have a bank account, there is no way you would be doing your UPI based transactions and so on, right? So all those blocks are now in place. Now comes the business of delivering different services.
See, leaving me with a very strong sense of optimism about our multiple digital platforms kind of working in unison over the next decade or so. What's next?
What's next is, I think, a new transformed India. And, all of these blocks are actually transforming society. The way people are interacting, the way people are consuming, everything is undergoing a sea change. And we see that on the roads today pretty much, where UPI is probably the most ubiquitous example, right? And we see that. And that has changed the way that people interact and behave. And there are any number of case studies from people who used to work at beauty salons who quit and started their own business, to people now doing the deliveries of everything, right? The Uber drivers, all those would not exist if you didn't have the mobile phone, you didn't have access to payments and so on.
And that is doing it all on cash, absolutely.
Doing on cash.
Great. So that's the right note on which I need to kind of change gears. And before we close, ask you about your latest initiative. You are the co-founder of this not-for-profit company, Network of Indian Cultural Enterprises. It's got a nice name, niceorg.in. What are you planning to do over here, Sanjay?
So again, I believe that entrepreneurship is the vehicle for transforming this country. And when I say entrepreneurship, I'm not talking about it in the sense that we understand it in a Silicon Valley sense or in a purely Bangalore type of sense. Entrepreneurship is a state of mind, meaning problem solving and figuring out how to deal with challenges or seize opportunities. So at NICE, what we're doing is we're creating a platform where there will be cultural entrepreneurs. These are defined as entrepreneurs building branded businesses based on India's cultural assets. So there's education, there's workshops, there's mentorship, there is business plan competitions, then there are a bunch of potential funders.
So it's not just a platform, it's an ecosystem then.
It's an ecosystem, exactly. It's an orchestration of an ecosystem for cultural businesses. Then the third pillar is partnerships, fourth is policy, fifth is research. So the country's first policy brief on catalyzing cultural entrepreneurship was published by us. We brought out reports on investments in cultural enterprises and so on. So essentially get to a state where the IT or the tech sector is today. We want to get cultural businesses of India to that state in the next 5 to 7 years.
Wow. Any last words before we wrap up for budding entrepreneurs of today?
Yes, I think I'll just end with one thing. जब मन में है विश्वास, बाकी सब बकवास.
Excellent, Sanjay. Thank you
Thank
for
you very
coming.
Much.
Pleasure having you here.
My pleasure. Thank you.